Building a professional-grade mobile app is not easy. A lot of effort goes into making your app bug-free, performant, pleasant to use, and maintainable over time. This gets easier with years of experience, and it's helpful to have a coach to help you master these skills. Our guest today is Casey Daniel. Casey has been a professional mobile developer for 5 years, and he wants to help other people become professional mobile developers by helping them bridge the divide from building toy apps to building industrial strength and maintainable apps. Casey has recently turned his focus to Flutter app development for applications in the healthcare space. Casey joins the show to discuss his experience and lessons learned in building production-ready mobile apps. Casey also talks about the content he is creating to help others get skilled up as professional developers. Casey, welcome to the Developer Show.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
Usually what I try and do is start off by discussing the background of our guests, just to kind of help set context and kind of see what you've done in your background and how you got to where you are. So could you start off by talking a bit about your background? On your LinkedIn profile, it shows that you're a physics researcher and have done some interesting things. So looking forward to kind of going through that.
Yeah. So my undergrad degree is in physics. I kind of fell into it. I was planning on transferring into engineering and kind of fell in love with the problem solving aspect of physics. You know, you get a wide breadth of problems and you get taught how to problem solve. You don't care about what the problem is. You care about how to learn the problem. That kind of set me up for my career. You know, I did some classes in computational physics, and my undergrad research was helping a professor get his research going. You know, he had some remote instrumentation that data needed to be streamed back to a central server and processed and ingested and all of that fun stuff. From there, I was able to get a job at a startup called Identos, working as a software developer there, primarily backend. They do security for healthcare applications, and I did some contract work under them for a healthcare application there as well. I've also worked in aerospace. I worked for a company called NavBlue. They're owned by Airbus, and they do flight service software. So I worked on the flight planning team, hooking up all the different components that went into creating a flight planning software. And currently I'm working on a new project. It's called MYNORMATIVE. It's a fitness application for women to help contextualize their health with their fitness and who they are as a woman, you know, with their reproductive cycle and all of that information, kind of bringing it all together and putting it and giving you contextualized information.
Right. Yeah, that's really interesting. Sounds like you worked in some really interesting fields. Flight planning sounds really interesting. And like you said, you know, some of these other domains like physics, and I'm sure a lot of the kind of biology-based things nowadays, they rely a lot in terms of computers and being able to connect problems with computation. I think that really provides a good foundation in doing anything.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And do you miss that? Do you miss being a physicist, a scientist? You know, are you able to connect some of that to some of your current work?
I miss it a bit. University gave me a wide breadth of problems to solve. You know, every semester I was jumping into 3 new classes that had completely new problems. And I absolutely loved that. You know, where I work at a company for, you know, historically a couple of years, you don't get exposed to as much, but that doesn't mean it's not challenging in its own right. And so I'm still being challenged, and that's what I really enjoy.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. So now that we've covered your background, I'd like to talk about some of the more recent work you've done, particularly in mobile development. Could you kind of give a beginner's introduction to what goes into building a mobile app? I know it kind of seems like You kind of hear these stories about someone sitting down in their garage and building an app in a weekend. But as a practitioner, maybe you can just take us through like what are the steps that you go through?
Yeah, so the steps that I like to go through is design comes first, and not just UI design, but design of the guts of the application. So I'm a big proponent of clean architecture. I don't follow it to a T, but the layers definitely are something that's super important. And mapping out what your domain is, what your models are, or in conjunction with your UI planning, it makes it very clear what data needs to go where and how. And then from there, it's just an exercise in programming. It's once you have the guts planned out, it's a lot of the challenges that come with app development kind of disappear.
Yeah, that makes sense. And you mentioned clean architecture. Could you talk a little bit about what that is exactly?
Yeah, so clean architecture, I can't remember the name of the author right now, but there's a book out there called Clean Architecture, and the basis is you divide your app into layers. You have a UI layer, a services layer, and a domain layer. And all these layers are isolated from each other. So, two UIs don't talk to each other. They talk to each other through services. And two services don't talk to each other. They talk to each other through repositories. What it does is it lays out clear rules for what kind of logic belongs where. What is UI logic? What is business logic? What is storage logic? Because if you try and write storage routines for a database in your UI, you're going to end up with a huge UI that's just unmaintainable. It becomes untestable as well. So when you clear out these sections, unit testing becomes a lot easier to make sure that everything is going to work the way you think it does in edge cases. That's why I'm a huge fan of it. Of it makes the difficult parts of building an app easier.
And I guess it also helps in terms of kind of scaling the team and kind of separating concerns. And when you're building an app, what are the different type of skills, roles that go into it?
A lot of it is the problem solving. A lot of it is the planning problems that you really need to get good at thinking through, and it's hard to learn. From there, you can specialize in app design. You know, how to make a UI functional, how to make it addictive, how to how to make it delightful, how to make the experience for a user delightful is a skill on its own that people out there actually specialize in. And it's a route you can go down. There's also a lot of the architecture work behind the scenes that can also be a specialty in itself, and that's what I specialize in, is in the actual bones of an app, making sure that all your edge cases are covered, that logic works the way you think it's going to work, and things like that.
You mentioned that it takes a while to learn this. Can you think back to some of the early mistakes that you might have made when you were just starting out and the impact that it had on the particular thing that you were working on?
I've made tons of mistakes in my time. I've deleted databases. I've messed up UI. I've messed up rollouts of backends. What you really learn from them in general is how to know when to take your time to do something, and how to test it thoroughly. Because there's just because unit tests work doesn't mean that it's going to work in the production environment. Because unit tests just test little pieces of code in isolation. And so there's integration tests to make sure that the entire system works end to end. And then you have UI testing to make sure that the UI can actually render on, it's a big problem in mobile that on with Android and iOS, there's hundreds of different screen sizes that you have to make for. And making them work for every screen is a challenge in itself. And so the biggest thing you can take away from your mistakes is an area that you need to just slow down in. Don't rush yourself. Get it right.
And other things that you've picked up, like best practices, habits that help you to do that. And I suppose like sometimes when you're just starting out, it takes you kind of take the long road, and then you learn kind of how to automate or kind of be smarter about things. What are some of the best practices or kind of tools or things that you use to help you out in your day to day?
The number one tool that I would recommend is continuous integration, continuous development. So it's an ideal that you're constantly testing your code. So what I like to do is I like to set up a CI/CD service that every time I push a commit, it runs all the unit tests just to make sure things work, and will report back to me if I accidentally broke something. Because there have been dozens of times where I've broken something without knowing because I touched a different area of code that depends on what I just changed. And so running all of these tests every time you make a change catches things before they're broken. And then with the continuous development is, have a core group of people that you can constantly be pushing the app to. Friendly people that are okay with things breaking sometimes. It's important because, again, there's just so many different scenarios people can come up with that they run into out in the wild that you will never think of sitting down writing the code. I can't count how many race conditions have been found from, in Android, from fragments being pushed and still pushing the button in, half a millisecond after the screen gets pushed. And that just breaks the app. I've had that dozens of times, but you'll never figure that out sitting there. So constantly pushing out code and constantly testing it is the best way forward, in my opinion.
That's a great kind of overview in terms of mobile development in general, and learning how to take time and design things properly. And your background is in Android in terms of native development. Was that how you started out?
Yes, I up until about a year ago, I've been an Android owner through and through. So it made sense for me to start learning that.
And then more recently, you moved on to Flutter. Is that right?
Yes.
So when did you start working with Flutter, and how did you go about training yourself, being an Android developer, and then now moving into this different framework and programming language?
So a lot of it comes from, online resources. I purchased a Flutter course that was early on and sat down and built something. In my opinion, that's the best way to learn a new framework, is to think of a simple application and build it. I started with an Ontario health card validation app. I built out a backend service that communicated with the Ministry of Health to validate a health card, and then the app would interact with the backend. And that was enough to get me started. And from there, what I actually started doing is, that's about the time I started getting into clean architecture. And so I rewrote that app. And I wrote a couple of other simple applications that never really went anywhere. But what it really embedded in me was the design skills.
At what point did you say, Flutter is what I'm going to be focusing on now? Like, I feel confident enough that I have the skills and that the framework is solid enough for me to focus on it.
So I came into Flutter just after it went stable. So that point made sense for me, and how easy it was to make good UI. I actually first made the health card validation app in Android, and it was challenged to get things working smoothly the way I felt they should be. But in Flutter, it was just so much easier because the declarative UI. So in Android and iOS, your UI code lives separately from the rest of your code. Where in Flutter, you actually make the UI in Dart. And going through that experience kind of embedded in me that, yeah, this is the way forward. And since then, Swift UI and Jetpack Compose have come out, or are about to come out, that have really solidified that, yeah, this is the way we should be developing new applications. And with the ease of Flutter, to be able to get multi-platform, true multi-platform, just made sense to me.
And I want to spend a little bit of time talking about some of the specific features of Flutter versus native, just to help those who are thinking about making the transition. So the first one is around packages and plugins. So Flutter and Dart has a system for packages and plugins, and the bridging with native code. Can you talk about how that works and kind of contrast that with some of your experiences with native development?
So I actually try not to use too many packages and plugins. There are a lot out there. I feel like a lot of them are of low value. What I mean by that is they're just a simple widget exposed through an API. It makes more sense for me to take control of that code and embed it in my own application than it does for me to use a plugin. Because with a plugin, I'm depending on someone else. Dart is about to release non-nullability. So right now things are null by default, but it's changing to be more like Kotlin where things are not null unless you explicitly say they can be null. Now everyone's going to have to wait for all of these plugins that might not become non-nullable and have to deal with the consequences of that. So I try not to use too many packages and plugins. I have a couple core ones like I use Dio for HTTP. I use Flutter Block for my state management. And then from there, my rule of thumb is if it's just a couple of classes, just copy and paste the code from GitHub myself and use it, because then I can control it through and through.
Right, and I guess you have a better understanding of what it's doing, and if you need it to do something else, you can always make modifications.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. Okay. And then the next topic I want to talk about is around the kind of animation in Flutter. So I know Flutter has a great animation engine. You can do all kinds of things. However, it's quite common for when you first open up a Flutter app and maybe you do a push navigation or something, there's a little bit of jankiness of stuttering. I know that there have been some things that have been come out maybe in the last few months to address that in terms of I think warming up the UI or something to kind of start those animations sooner. But what's been your experience with that in terms of the potential jankiness of some of the animation?
So personally, it hasn't bothered me. I'm not. It's something I'm going to have to get super picky about very quickly here with MYNORMATIVE. For me, it's I focus more on the functionality first and make sure that works. Because with things like smoothness, you're kind of at the mercy of the framework. There are some simple things you can do, like make sure you're only updating what you need to update. Is my rule of thumb to just help that along a little bit. I don't need to update an entire page to update a little piece of text. So, and how you do that is you move state as far down the widget tree as possible. So if you need a stateless widget, don't be afraid to use it. They're just fine. But just make sure when you change the state, you're not changing everything. You're just changing the little bit of code that actually needs that change, that actually is changing state. That principle has made it so that I haven't seen much of the jankiness, except on web, but their web is in beta and they're still working on performance issues there.
Okay. All right. That's good advice. And next topic's around testing. So you mentioned that, with the clean architecture, it makes it easier to apply unit testing and other kinds of like UI testing. Can you talk a bit about how you've done that in Flutter and, what's been your experience in Flutter versus doing it on native?
Yeah. So UI testing is something I'm not great at. It's an area that I still need to do a lot of learning in. But from what I have seen, it's a lot easier to test on Flutter because you don't need to test an entire screen. You can test individual widgets. So you can test a lot smaller before you test a lot bigger. And so I think that helps quite a bit. And because UI is code, you're just testing code. You're not testing code through XML. And so I think that makes UI testing a lot easier. And as I mentioned with unit testing, if your UI never contains business logic, it becomes a lot easier to manage and unit test all your business logic because they're in qubits or blocks or models or whatever state management solution you're using. All your logic is in there, completely isolated away from your UI. So you just make sure it outputs the correct states. And then it's the UI's responsibility to render that state.
And the next topic is around analytics monitoring and crash reporting. So once your app is in production, it's important to know how users are, the experience that they're having when it's in the wild, and you're not right next to them. Uh, can you talk about your experience with doing that in Flutter, and maybe some of the services that you've had experience with?
Yeah, so the big one for both analytics and Crashlytics is Firebase. And when it comes to Flutter, unfortunately, that's really the best one I've found so far. I haven't seen Segment or other analytics providers come out with Flutter SDKs. They might exist and I just haven't seen them, but I haven't seen good, high quality ones like exist for Firebase. And I think that's an area of improvement for the Flutter ecosystem. Is as it gets bigger, there's more of a need for this type of reporting. When it comes to analytics, I just want to make the comment of don't add analytics just for the sake of analytics. Have questions in mind that you want to answer, like how many clicks do users take to get to the screen? Or when they get to the screen, what's the first thing they click on? And then from there, your analytics becomes a lot easier because you're asking questions. You're asking your user questions without having to interview them. It'll make your analytics funnel a lot cleaner.
Yeah, that's right. And analytics is an interesting one because it also ties back into architecture a bit, doesn't it? Because
Yep.
I remember reading or watching a post, YouTube or something, from the people that were involved with Flutter Block. And essentially, once you have your app in that architecture and you're monitoring states, events and states, a lot of the analytics kind of just falls through that same architecture. So kind of ties back to what we were talking about before.
Yeah. And when you make your user interface a function of state, you can put a lot of that just in your model or in your block because that's what it represents what the UI is rendering. You don't need to tie in button events to the button. You can make it behind the scenes and make it a lot cleaner to manage.
And the last of these kind of rapid fire topics is localization, and I guess internationalization. Uh, can you talk about how to think about that, and how you go about making your apps so that they can work in different languages and regions?
Yeah. So I've done this for native Android, and in my opinion, it's a lot easier in native Android because you have your strings.xml file. You can write them all in your native language and then just send that XML file off to get translated through friends, family, or paid services. And then just take those XML files back, put them into the app, and boom, you've got internationalization and localization. Where in Flutter, it's a little bit tricky because strings are just strings, and your text blocks are just based on those strings. So there's a lot of different methods out there, and the community kind of has not standardized around one preferred way of like JSON files or AAB files or sorry AAR files. I think they are, and I think it's another area of improvement is better enforcement of string localizations. And what I mean by that is like when I make a text widget and just throw a string in there, a hard coded string in there, the UI doesn't tell me, or my IDE doesn't tell me, hey, you might want to go translate this string. Where on Android it does. It's just like, please don't do this. Put it in a translatable file. So I think that's an area where Flutter it has some room for improvement.
Right. Okay. So I guess now if you wanted to do that, you'd have to kind of design your own methodology around it to make sure that you're not forgetting to do things the right way.
Yeah, I have to do my own methodology, and I have to go through my entire app and remove all my strings. There's no find me all of my strings that I have untranslated. It's up to you to manage it all.
Okay. I mean, hopefully we'll start seeing some standardization and services built around that, and I'm pretty sure that the Flutter team are thinking about that as well. So
Oh,
hopefully,
sure.
yeah, hopefully we'll see something coming down the line. All right. So thanks for going through all of those specific topics. I wanted to move on now to the your current work. So you mentioned that you're building this health app targeted towards women's health. Is there anything else you can tell us about the app? I know it hasn't launched yet, but if there's anything that you can kind of talk about, that would be great.
Yeah, so I can't go into too many details, but you can check it out at mynormative.app for anyone who's actually curious about it. And like I mentioned earlier, it's about contextualizing your health. There's a lot of something that we've found has surprised many women is that at certain points in your hormonal cycle, you gain water weight, and so it's harder to lose weight during that period. It means nothing against your goal of losing weight. It's just a little harder that week. It's amazed me. I didn't know that, and I think a lot of people don't. And so it's about contextualizing that kind of information, so that way you don't feel bad that your run felt a little shitty today because you're allowed that every now and then.
Okay, that makes sense. And now the name makes a bit more sense now too as well. So
Yeah.
that's great. And what does your team look like? Do you have so I guess you're doing the so you mentioned that your specialty is in the um, kind of like the back end engineering, not back end, but kind of like more foundational type of software engineering. What are the different roles that you have on your team right now?
When it comes to development, we have an intern, and it's just the two of us right now. But that's enough to keep a good pace of development. I feel like at this stage things are changing too rapidly for someone to specialize in one area. It's the startup life where things change on a dime because business needs change very quickly depending on feedback from the market. And so in an early startup stage, you don't want a large team. You want a small team that is agile and can move quickly. And that's what we have right now. And I'm really happy with it.
Okay, oh, that's good. Um, and it's always good to have when you're a startup having very kind of being able to communicate very efficiently. Um, so having the shorter cycles and communication lines is definitely much better. And have there been any kind of unique engineering challenges that you've had to grapple with while you've been working on it so far?
I wouldn't say we have had anything too unique. There's a lot of how do I build out this type of widget, and you just kind of have to sit there and think about it and come up with a good plan. What makes these challenges not very challenging is always having someone to bounce an idea off of, and that's why I don't like doing solo development, but I like small team development because you can always just ping a coworker to say, "Hey, I just can't wrap my head around this for 30 seconds. Can I borrow you for 30 seconds?" And I've always kind of felt that helps get around any kind of challenges you have.
Yeah, definitely. And it's motivating as well. I think having someone else, um, yeah, working in isolation definitely is it slows you down. Having someone else there who you can talk to and helps push you along and push your thinking along is definitely helpful.
Yeah.
And when is the app planned to launch? When you
March 8th.
March 8th. Okay, great. That's a very specific date. That's great.
It's
Is it
International Women's Day.
perfect? That makes a lot of sense, and that is the perfect day for you to launch. So
Exactly.
yeah, looking forward to seeing that. Um, and so now I just wanted to kind of wrap up and kind of talk about some of the kind of like more high level things again.
Yep.
So going back to Flutter, it's still still early days relatively for Flutter, and there've been some apps out there that have been launched. I know Google recently launched their app, Google Pay app, on that was built with Flutter, which looks pretty cool. What are some of the apps that you've seen out there in the wild that you think are really great, good examples of Flutter apps for people to go look at?
I think Reflecty has been my favorite so far. And my reason for that is it doesn't look like a native app. So what the beauty of Flutter is things look the same because Flutter renders everything on its own. It doesn't use like React Native will pull a native widget into JavaScript for you to use, where Flutter just says, here's a canvas, go. And you can come up with really unique user interface experiences. And I think Reflecti has done an absolutely fantastic job of that. It doesn't look like an iOS app or an Android app. It looks like a good app.
Okay, excellent. Yeah, I'll definitely go check that out, and hopefully people in the audience can go check it out as well. And when we spoke earlier before we did the recording of the show, you mentioned that you have plans to share your knowledge of what you've learned in terms of app development, particularly around like system design and end to end. Can you talk about some of the content that you're planning to put out there soon?
Yeah, so something I've actually already started is I'm building an open source podcast listening application. You can find it at whitewhiskeywolf.com. And I've started a blog series and a video series under the same name of just me going through building out an application and explaining some of the design choices I make along the way. And that's already live. And in the next couple of weeks, my friends and I are going to be launching a mobile app podcast talking about the state of the ecosystem and real app development and real war stories. And that's going to be available at who'syourdev.com.
Okay, excellent. I look forward to listening to the podcast when it launches, and I will go and follow along as you build the podcasting app on your YouTube. So it's on YouTube, is that right?
It's on YouTube, and I have a blog.
And a blog. Okay, that's great. So I'll check that out, and we'll put those into the show notes for other people to check them out as well. And how can people connect with you online?
Yeah, so my Twitter handle is whitewhiskeywol1. I tried to have White Whiskey Wolf, but it wouldn't let me. It automated that one. Yeah, you can connect with me there, or through my YouTube channel is another good one.
Okay, perfect. So thanks a lot, Casey. This has been great. I know that a lot of people out there who are starting out with Flutter definitely need good guidance on how to do things well. And I'm definitely looking forward to following along on your YouTube course and listening to the podcast and helping to help people learn Flutter and learn good engineering skills. Thanks a lot for being on the show.
Thank you for having me.